with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Juli Berwald, who received her PhD in ocean science from the University of Southern California. The author of Spineless, The Science of Jellyfish and the Art of Growing a Backbone, she's written for a number of publications, including the New York Times, National Geographic, and Texas Monthly. Her latest book, Life on the Rocks, Building a Future for Coral Reefs, was actually inspired by the 2018 Reef Futures meeting, where she discovered scientists and activists doing everything possible to support the health of coral reefs. Her book celebrates what it means to keep fighting a battle whose outcome is uncertain, and the beauty of small victories. And as a high school student, there's not a lot of books that I get excited about anymore, but this is one of them. So with that, Juli, come on up.
Thank you guys so much for giving me the chance to come speak to you. It feels really amazing to be standing up here. I feel very honored, and thank you to all the team who has made this happen during really rough times. It's working really smoothly, and thank you. The reason I'm standing up here started with a piece of paper on the side of a wall. So unlike Kara, I did not grow up close to the ocean at all. I grew up in Missouri, and I had never stuck my head beneath the waves until I went on a study abroad program in college to Israel. And I was miserable. I hated it. I didn't get along with people. I was eating too much falafel, and it was really rough on me. But I walked past a building, and there was this marine ecology course, sign up here. So I did, and they put us on a bus and drove us through the desert, and we get off the bus, and there's these crazy, beautiful red mountains and this insane sea, and suddenly people are throwing a mask and a snorkel at me and saying, walk backwards down the beach. And so I did, and I turned and I looked in the water, and you guys all know, it was what? I live on the planet with this, and I never knew it existed. And I don't know if you've had that experience, but it's what is this, and how is it so beautiful and full of life? And I was blown away. It was it was life-changing. So I crawled out of the water at freezing cold, and Yossi Loya was standing there, who some of you guys might know, and he was like, memorize these 20 species of coral by tomorrow morning, because there'll be a test. And I was like, okay. So I did, and those names became incantations of this world that I wanted to know more about. So I decided to become a marine biologist, and I applied to every coral program I could for grad school, and I didn't get into a single one, but I also was not a very good candidate, having never taken really any biology classes before that moment. But I did get into grad school to study something beautiful and colorful, though. This was when we had the first images of the oceans from the SeaWift satellite, and the question, we knew already at that point that carbon dioxide was accumulating in the atmosphere and causing it to warm up, but we didn't know how much the ocean was helping us. And so this was part of my dissertation, was to understand how much photosynthesis, the phytoplankton in the ocean, are responsible for, how much carbon dioxide they can take up. I contributed a very small piece to that, but it turns out, 30%. So about 30% of the carbon dioxide that our fossil fuels have turned into has been absorbed by the ocean, and the ocean does this incredible job for us, protecting us. And if we didn't have the ocean doing that, we would be in a lot worse shape right now. But after that, maybe because I was never as passionate about satellite imagery as I was about coral, I fell off the academic path, and I started writing articles. And I got a little gig working with National Geographic for a while, and I was asked to fact-check this article, which is about that twin problem that carbon dioxide has, which is ocean acidification. And I was fact-checking the graphic over there on the right-hand side, and the jellyfish popped out at me, and I was like, Cnidarians. And so I was like, they're not coral, but they're close. And so I said, well, how much do we know about how much ocean acidification is affecting the jellyfish? And it turns out we didn't know too much, but we also didn't know too much about jellyfish in general. And once I started like digging into it, I found out that the story of jellyfish was really fascinating and really unknown. And I ended up writing a whole book about it called Spineless: The Science of Jellyfish and the Art of Growing a Backbone. And this book really found its audience because I think as I traveled around talking to jellyfish scientists about their work, I was also retracing a lot of the paths that I had walked as a scientist. And I realized that in order to tell the story in a way that worked, I needed to bring my own voice into it and to confront how I had shifted from being a scientist to a writer. And I had to learn that my voice had a place in the world, especially a world where the oceans are facing ever greater challenges. So then after Spineless went out into the world, I thought, well, what's my next book gonna be about? And I went back to like the coral love that I had had. But you know how it is with an old romance, like they turned their back on me the first time, like how do I go back there? And also I knew that the coral were hurting. But, you know, I did what you do when you start thinking about that old romance, you know, I stalked them online. So my Google alerts told me that there was this meeting coming up called Reef Futures 2018. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just go have coffee. And so I walked into this meeting with a lot of trepidation, thinking, first of all, was I walking into a meeting that was just going to be the story of all the bad things happening to coral? Was it going to be where I would have to write the obituary for the coral? I was also thinking, am I really going to write a book about coral, and how am I going to do them justice? But what I discovered at this meeting was incredible creativity and incredible innovation around every aspect of science and practice. I discovered a coral world that had opened up so much since the last time I tried to get in. And I discovered stories of farming and fragging and skinning. I heard about aquaria where coral were teased into spawning before tea time. I saw corals spawn. I watched them land on Tinker Toy-looking tetrapods and settle in coral kindergartens. I saw coral trees and coral orchards and reef stars, and I learned about gold-infused frozen embryos and genetic diversity and genetic load and reticulated evolution and durastinium and symbiodinium. And I also heard, of course, about Skittle D, but I also heard about the biggest land-based effort to rescue coral that had ever been attempted. I spoke to mappers and aquarists, physiologists and engineers, policymakers, economists, investors, managers, hoteliers, and yes, even candy bar magnets. I couldn't speak to everyone, but everyone who I spoke to was incredibly generous and welcoming and free with their information. I also saw reefs that were still rich and healthy that so many of you are helping to protect. I somehow got an invitation from the Australian Restoration and Adaptation Program's Dan Harrison to take part in the very first cloud brightening effort on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. I was supposed to leave at the end of March in 2020. No spoilers, that did not happen. But before I knew it wasn't going to happen, I was very, very excited for the opportunity, and I was also very, very nervous. Not just because Dan had told me that we would be sleeping on a shipping container welded to the fantail of a ship, but alongside all I was learning about coral, I was also struggling to learn what had changed in my once happy and engaged 14-year-old daughter. Even when I was driving off of Key Largo from the meeting in 2018, I was on the phone the whole way back to the airport trying to see if she could continue in school. By the time I was supposed to be going to Australia, what turned out to be a very severe case of obsessive-compulsive disorder had metastasized so much that my daughter could hardly leave the house. A few months earlier, in February of 2020, my husband and I got word that my daughter could have a bed at a residential behavioral health program in Wisconsin. Her admission date was 2 days before I was supposed to leave for Australia. Given that there's only 36 beds for severe OCD for adolescents in the United States, and as unknowns about how COVID was spreading were everywhere, my husband and I decided to drive to Wisconsin from Texas, where we live, to make sure that our daughter would get the treatment that she needed. It turns out we weren't the only ones making a 1,000-mile drive. In Australia, Dan Harrison and his team also drove from Southern Cross University to Townsville with the entire research team bubbling up against COVID. They were able to get out to sea, and their experiment was more successful than expected. Our experiment was as well. Our daughter spent 100 days in Wisconsin, and the tools she learned there saved her life. And then, in the quiet of COVID, as I pondered the corals and my daughter, what seemed disparate stories became intertwined. I don't need to tell you that coral reefs are truly foundational. You know the numbers. 1/4 of all marine life, 1 billion people's source of protein, 97% of wave diffusion, 2.7 trillion in economic value. But likewise, mental health is foundational, and everything that rests on it, friendships, academics, and a future, falls away if we don't have it. Similarly, these two things are so often invisible. As terrestrial beings, so many of us forget about the life beneath the sea. And it's very easy to look at a person and not see the suffering beneath the surface. But perhaps the greatest parallel is that these are issues that cannot be solved by a silver bullet, much as we might want one. They require a lot of work over a lot of time with a lot of funding and constant vigilance. And so I didn't plan to write these stories together, but when I sent the draft to my editor, she said it was some of the most powerful writing I'd done. With my daughter's approval, it all ended up in this book, Life on the Rocks, Building a Future for Coral Reefs. And like Spineless, this book too has found its audience. The story of reef futures and all that you do for the coral has made its way into the New York Times, the New Yorker Science, the Wall Street Journal, and Scientific American, among others. But even more amazingly, people contact me every day, asking me what they can do to help the coral. They are old and they are young, they are from coasts and they are from landlocked places, and they are excited and energized by your work, your energy, your creativity, and your optimism. A month ago, I had the honor of being one of 90 authors invited to the National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. The reception is in the Library of Congress, which is probably the prettiest building in Washington, D.C., and it's this ornate building, and around the rotunda are all these quotes etched in bronze. And this one caught my attention. It says, "Books must follow science, and not science books." The source of whatever I have the opportunity to write is the work that you do out in the field and in the lab. Your work must exist first. It has been my great privilege to follow your science and to tell your stories. And I just wanted to come here to say thank you for being such an incredible inspiration. I hope I did the coral justice, and I hope I have the honor of continuing to follow you in the future. Thank you.